35 years. That's how long two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author Robert Caro has spent researching, thinking about, and writing about the life of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. The result of that extraordinary toil, other than 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 3,388 pages so far. Caro has just published The Passage of Power, the 4th volume of his LBJ biography, and the 76-year-old Caro is far from done. He says he will move to Vietnam to write the next volume on the war years. Before he does that, Robert Caro joins me today.
Great to be back.
So, in the last volume, you had gotten to the point where Lyndon Johnson, through this extraordinary skill he had at running the Senate, had passed the most important civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, perhaps one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history.
Yes.
Then he begins his years as vice president,
yes,
which is a huge letdown for a man who had really run Washington.
Yes. And he's humiliated by the Kennedys. You know, they look down on him, and they're afraid of him. They're afraid to let him off a leash. So they keep him on a very short leash. He's, as you say, probably the greatest legislator in American history, certainly in the 20th century. They don't ask him for any advice on legislation. When he's invited to parties, like at Bobby Kennedy's Hickory Hill house, he's put at what Ethel Kennedy, Robert's wife, calls the loser's table, and he knows it's the loser's table. They have a nickname for him in the Kennedy White House, Rufus Cornpone, or Uncle Rufus. So he's humiliated and cut out of power completely for almost 3 years.
And he and Bobby Kennedy particularly really hate each other. Describe the first time, the meeting you described.
Well, you say, why did, you know, as a historian, you hate to use words as strong as hated, but it's not too strong to describe the feeling between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy. And there were other reasons for it, but part of it was just chemistry.
And then Bobby Kennedy becomes the second most powerful man in America and is treating Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, as a nothing.
As a nothing. Johnson literally has to ask Kennedy's permission every time he wants to use a plane for a trip. Every word and every speech that he gives has to be cleared by the White House, really by Robert Kennedy. He's, you know, one of his secretaries said, the Kennedys, they made you feel that they were in and you weren't. So in many ways, Johnson is just, these are the terrible years of his life, you know. Someone said it was like a great bull being put out to pasture late in his career.
Was part of it class, that the Kennedys were seen as this kind of upper class, Harvard educated, and Johnson was not?
Well, in Johnson's mind, you know, there's a reality to it also. Jack Kennedy went to Harvard. A lot of the Kennedy people went to Harvard. Lyndon Johnson went to Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He describes that as the poor boys' school. I went to the poor boys' school. You went to the Southwest Teachers College because you couldn't afford to go to the University of Texas, and he knew that. All his life, he knew he had been cheated out of an education, and he was ashamed of it.
When you get to the assassination, take us through, what was it like for Johnson? We understand so much about it, but give us the perspective from the guy who suddenly realizes, with all the tragedy, that he has just gone from being a nobody to being the most powerful man in the world.
Well, I'll start in the very moment. He's riding in the third car behind President Kennedy. There is the crack of a gunshot. Most of the people think it's a backfire from a motorcycle or a firecracker going on. But the Secret Service agent who's sitting in the front seat of Johnson's car, a man named Rufus Youngblood, knows in the instant that it's a hunting rifle. He whirls around and grabs Johnson's right shoulder, Johnson sitting on the right side of the back seat, and throws Johnson on the floor, leaps over the front seat, sprawls on top of Johnson, and lays there, shielding Johnson's body with his own while the cars speed off to Parkland Hospital. Johnson was later to say, I would never forget his knees in my back and his elbows in my back. He says to Johnson as they pull into Parkland Hospital, when we stop, get out of this car, we're not stopping for anybody. Don't look around. We're going to get you to a secure place. They yank Johnson out of the car. He doesn't even have time to see what's in Jack Kennedy's car, which is actually the president's body, still lying there on Jackie's lap. 4 agents run him through the corridors looking for a secure place. Johnson, you know, Fareed, doesn't know. He stands there for 40 minutes. No one gives him word. He tries to find out what President Kennedy's condition is, and they just say the doctors are working on him. After 40 minutes, Kenny O'Donnell, who was a Kennedy aide who loved Jack Kennedy, comes through the door, and Lady Bird Johnson was to recall in her diary that seeing the stricken face of Kenny O'Donnell, who loved him, we knew. A moment later, another Kennedy aide comes into the room and says to Johnson, Mr. President. It's the first time anyone's ever called him Mr. President. So you say for 40 minutes, the man who actually probably is already President of the United States is standing. The thing about him is he stands almost motionless, standing against this wall. Lady Bird is sitting beside him. No one knows what he's thinking. But when he is addressed as Mr. President, he starts immediately giving decisive orders.
And he orchestrates the famous photograph that we have all seen, because yes, he wants Jackie Kennedy to be on that plane flying back to Washington. He wants the world to see that this was a peaceful transfer of power, but with the consent and in a sense, the buy-in of the Kennedys. Well,
he takes steps to do that. You also have to say, however, with Lyndon Johnson, nothing is simple. And you have to say there is another motive that he says is the motive. I'm not leaving her. They tell him, the Secret Service says, we're getting you on the plane and we're taking off immediately for Washington because the White House we can make secure. Johnson says, no, you're not. I'm not leaving Mrs. Kennedy here. And they say to him, well, she won't leave without her husband's body. He says, then we'll wait on the plane for her and the coffin to come aboard. It's also true that he wants Jackie Kennedy beside him when he's taking the oath to show, just as you say, the continuity. And she realizes this too. You know, when Ken O'Donnell says, Lyndon Johnson wants you beside him, she says something, the exact quote is in the book, for history's sake, that's what I should do.
Wow. When we come